I'm Aaron Mate, sitting in for Jimmy Dore, and we're here with John Mearsheimer, the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago, leading political scientist and international relations scholar. And John, Steve Witkoff, the top Trump envoy, made some really important news this week on CNN when he not only said that he believes that Russia was provoked in Ukraine, but he also said that the peace talks that Russia and Ukraine had in the spring of 2022 could be a guidepost for the new peace talks that the U.S. wants to see happen to end the Ukraine war. This is Steve Witkoff.
Have indicated that they are responsive to an end to this. There were very, what I'll call cogent and substantive negotiations framed in something that's called the Istanbul Protocol Agreement. We came very, very close to signing something, and I think we'll be using that framework as a guidepost to get a peace deal done between Ukraine and Russia, and I think that will be an amazing day. And the fact is, the president understands how to get deals done. Deals only work, Jake, when they're good for all the parties, and that's the pathway that we're on here.
So, Professor Mearsheimer, that to me is a really significant clip, because he's not only saying that we already have a framework in place, which is the Istanbul peace talks, which were held between Ukraine and Russia in the spring of 2022. The fact that he's even acknowledging those peace talks, to me, is seismic, because their existence has been completely whitewashed by our political and media establishment, which has refused to basically report on what happened then in a significant way, because it undermined this narrative that Russia can't be negotiated with. There's no possibility for a settlement. So therefore, we have to keep flooding Ukraine with weapons. And here is a top Trump official saying that those talks actually were productive. They were close to a deal, and we're going to return to them. So your reaction to this acknowledgement and this vision being laid out by Steve Witkoff?
Two quick points, Aaron. One is, I think Steve Witkoff is an impressive individual. He is a no-nonsense person. He's not rude. He doesn't blow V8. He just tells it like it is. And it's easy to see why Trump trusts him. And I think in very important ways, he is Trump's principal foreign policy advisor. And when he speaks, it's actually quite impressive. I don't always agree with everything he says, especially regarding the Middle East. Second point I'd make to you is, I think that those three parameters that I discussed before were all front and center at the Istanbul talks in March, April 2022. And just to refresh your memory, they are, number one, that Ukraine has to be a genuinely neutral state. Two, there has to be a significant amount of demilitarization in Ukraine so that it does not have much offensive military capability. And number three, the question of territory. I think on the first two, you'll have no problems moving forward. I think that you're going to get a neutral Ukraine. The Americans are not going to provide a security guarantee. They're not going to allow NATO to provide a security guarantee. You'll get a neutral Ukraine. And I also think it will not be that difficult to get some demilitarization. And of course, it was not difficult to get some demilitarization at Istanbul, and the Ukrainians agreed to neutrality. So those two issues are taken care of. I think the tricky issue is territory. At Istanbul, it's not perfectly clear what the Russians were asking for, but they were certainly asking for more. The Russians were certainly asking for less than the 4 oblasts plus Crimea. And the Russians are now demanding those 4 oblasts plus Crimea. And it is possible they could even ask for more territory. So I think the tricky issue moving forward, and I'm not saying that the Trump administration won't be able to work out a deal with the Russians, but the tricky issue moving forward, I think, will be territory. And my argument there, just to embellish a bit on this point, is that the Americans and the Ukrainians, although the Ukrainians don't know it, have a vested interest in getting a quick settlement. And the reason is you don't want the Russians to conquer any more territory. Because if the Russians conquer more territory besides the territory included in those 4 oblasts, it'll be very hard to get them to give that territory up. Odessa is a good example. Ukraine now controls Odessa, and it's in Ukraine's interest to make sure the Russians don't take Odessa. But the longer this war goes on, the greater the likelihood that the Russians will take Odessa. And the territorial issue for settling the war will then become much more complicated. So I think territory is the key issue. And I think what the Trump administration wants to do is shut this one down as quickly as possible so that the Russians are content with merely controlling for the foreseeable future or annexing those 4 oblasts plus Crimea. But if the war is not shut down quickly, there's a serious possibility the Russians will end up with a lot more territory. And then figuring out exactly how to end this one and maybe get the Ukrainians and the Europeans on board will be much trickier. So that's my thinking about how Istanbul relates to the deal that Witkoff is trying to work out now with the Russians.
What Witkoff didn't mention is why those Istanbul talks were undermined back in April 2022. And we know now from multiple sources that Ukraine was told by the US and the UK that they would not offer Ukraine the security guarantees that Ukraine needed to underpin that agreement with Russia. And Boris Johnson personally encouraged Zelensky to walk away. And only recently did Victoria Nuland, a senior State Department official under Biden, acknowledge, after a long bout of silence, that yes, the US encouraged Zelensky not to take that deal. This is Victoria Nuland.
It was a story first told by former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett that both sides were really close to the end, to the successful end of the negotiations, and then Prime Minister Boris Johnson interfered and stopped prevented Ukrainians from signing the deal. And then Ukrainian Representative Arahami kind of confirmed it, that yes, he said in an interview that there was some kind of advice from Boris Johnson to stop negotiating and to win this war militarily. Where is the myth? Where is the truth?
Relatively late in the game, the Ukrainians began asking for advice on where this thing was going. And it became clear to us, clear to the Brits, clear to others, that Putin's main condition was buried in an annex to this document that they were working on. Mm-hmm. And it included limits on the precise kinds of weapon systems that Ukraine could have after the deal, such that Ukraine would basically be neutered as a military force. And there were no similar constraints on Russia. Russia wasn't required to pull back. Russia wasn't required to have a buffer zone from the Ukrainian border, wasn't required to have the same constraints on its military facing Ukraine. And so people inside Ukraine and people outside Ukraine started asking questions about whether this was a good deal, and it was at that point that it fell apart.
So people inside of Ukraine and outside of Ukraine, by which she means, I presumably the U.S., started asking questions, and then it fell apart. So, Professor Mearsheimer, what do you make there of her explanation that if Zelensky had accepted this deal, it would have neutered Ukraine, in her words? And what do you make of the fact that, or the possibility that if this is the guidepost, as the Trump administration now says, for future talks, where does that leave Zelensky, who will have walked away from a far better deal than he will ever get now?
Well, I think she's basically right that it would have neutered Ukraine. I don't like the word neutered, but the thrust of what she's saying is correct. As I said before, the Russians insist that Ukraine not have significant offensive military capability. There's going to have to be some significant demilitarization of Ukraine. That was on the table. It wasn't hidden. It was on the table in the Istanbul negotiations, and it's back on the table again. So I think she's correct in that regard. But that still leaves the question, why did they walk away? I mean, it's quite clear that Zelensky was willing to go along with the deal as it was developing. It wasn't Zelensky who said, this deal is terrible, I'm going to walk away. It's Boris Johnson and the Americans who came in and basically told him he should walk away. So the question you want to ask yourself is, why did that happen? Especially given where we are today. God, it would have been so much better if the Ukrainians had gotten a peace deal back then, rather than take the one that's coming down the pike now. The answer, I think, Aaron, is that we thought, and I'm talking here about the West and mainly the United States and people like Victoria Nuland, we thought that we could beat the Russians. We thought the Russians were in real trouble. The Ukrainians had stymied them on the battlefield. And furthermore, we were very optimistic about what we could do with sanctions. You know, we recently had the Munich conference where J.D. Vance gave his famous speech. Well, there was a Munich conference in February of 2022. It went from February 18th to February 20th, 2022. And the war, of course, was launched by the Russians on February 24th, 4 days after the Munich conference back then ended. If you go back and look at what was said at the Munich conference in February of 2022, and you listen to how the leaders from the West are talking about a possible conflict with Russia, we really believed that we could bring them to their knees with our sanctions. We believed we had the upper hand. And of course, this is why we made no effort to avoid a war on February 24th, 2022. This is why we basically ignored the Russian efforts to try to figure out how we could avoid a conflict. We thought we had the Russians right where we wanted them. And then when the Ukrainians did well on the battlefield, and they did surprisingly well on the battlefield right after the conflict broke out, we were convinced that we had the Russians right where we wanted them. And we told Zelensky to walk away. Now, to take this a step further, Aaron, I'm sure you remember that fall of 2022, after the Ukrainians had two successful offensives, one in Kherson and the other in Kharkiv, where the Russians had given up a lot of territory. General Milley, who was then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said, the Ukrainians are at their high water mark, and now is the time to cut a deal. I think this is either in September or October of 2022. Yeah. It's the fall of 2022.
Yep.
And Ukraine has done well, right? And the sanctions are on. But Milley understands that this is the high watermark for the Ukrainians because he sees the Russians mobilizing. Remember, Putin mobilizes 300,000 soldiers in the fall of 2022, and he has a much larger manpower base, a much larger industrial base. And if this war turns into a war of attrition, the Ukrainians are in real trouble. Milley, of course, understands this, says, let's cut a deal. He says this publicly. The White House moves in and basically tells him to close his mouth. We're not going to get a deal. We're going to continue to prosecute the war. So it's very important to understand that we in the West, and here we're talking mainly about the United States, acted foolishly, not only in March, April of 2022, but in the fall of 2022 as well. And then, of course, as I've said before, in 2023 and in 2024, the tide turns. Milley is proved correct. The Ukrainians had reached the high water mark. And then as the war dragged on, and as it's dragging on now, the situation just gets worse and worse for Ukraine because they did not have an industrial base that could compete with the Russian industrial base, and the Western industrial bases couldn't make up for the lack of a powerful industrial base in Ukraine. So they're in real trouble. And in terms of manpower, the Russians have a population that's about 5 times bigger than Ukraine's population. That means they could produce a lot more soldiers. And with a lot more soldiers, a lot more artillery, a lot more air power, Ukraine is doomed. And then along comes Donald Trump, and Donald Trump wants to cut his losses and get out of Ukraine. And the Ukrainians are really doomed. And that, of course, is why they should cut a deal.
Is there a historical precedent for the nation's top military officer, General Milley, breaking with the White House openly advocating against the White House policy and urging the White House to negotiate with another power, but instead the bureaucrats in the State Department, Antony Blinken, who's supposed to be a diplomat, winning the argument that there should be more war? So basically, the diplomats want war and the top military officer wants peace?
No, I know no instance of that happening. I think the only thing that comes close is Douglas MacArthur's misbehavior during the Korean War, where he crossed with Harry Truman, but he was not the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was just the U.S. commander in Korea, and of course he was quickly fired. But I think there's no analogy that I know of to what happened to Milley, and it just would have been very helpful for the Ukrainians and for us and for the Russians if a deal had been cut in late 22 or in early 2022. But this war could have been shut down. I mean, what we're saying here, Aaron, and you know this because it's an old story in the circles we move in, this war could have been prevented, number one. Number two, it could have been shut down shortly after it started. And by the way, Naftali Bennett, the former Israeli prime minister, who was also involved in a separate set of negotiations in March, April 2022, effectively says the same thing. But then third, we could have shut it down in the fall of 2022 in all likelihood. But the Americans and the Europeans, but mainly the Americans, had no interest in shutting this war down. They had no interest in preventing it to begin with, and then no interest in shutting it down. And instead, we encouraged the Ukrainians to fight on in the mistaken belief that Ukraine would prevail. And if you look at what's happened to Ukraine now, I think the really big question is who bears responsibility for this catastrophe for Ukraine? Who is responsible? And of course, our argument is the people who pushed this war and then did nothing to shut it down and instead up the ante, they're responsible. They're the ones that have blood on their hands. But of course, people in the establishment want to say that Vladimir Putin is responsible. He wasn't provoked. He just was interested in creating a greater Russia, conquering territory in Eastern Europe, restoring the Soviet Empire, dominating Europe. These are all nonsensical arguments. Putin had no such interest. And furthermore, he doesn't even have the capability to conquer all of Ukraine, much less conquer Eastern Europe and other parts of Europe. Just not going to happen. But that's the story that people in the establishment tell. And the reason they tell that story is they want to blame Putin for this catastrophe when they should be blaming themselves. They made a colossal blunder in provoking the Russians and then not reaching some sort of accommodation with the Russians when they could have, and leading to this catastrophic situation where Ukraine has effectively been destroyed.